soft crackle of old film. The faint hum of static. A voice begins speaking in a low, measured tone. Narrator, Theo. The photograph you're looking at now was never meant to be found. It surfaced by accident in the autumn of 1989, when a demolition crew began clearing the remains of Ashcroft Manor, a decaying estate on the edge of what used to be Graven Hollow, a village long erased from local records. Buried beneath a collapsed fireplace, the workers uncovered a small wooden box, scorched at the edges and bound with frayed red cord. Inside, wrapped in what was once linen but had hardened with age, they found a glass photographic plate, its surface coated with a thin film of dust and a smell faintly reminiscent of iron. Alongside it was a slip of parchment, so brittle it broke upon touch. The writing, in faded brown ink, contained only 4 words. "Do not wake them." No one at first could make sense of the image. It appeared to be an early 20th century exposure, the kind taken by traveling photographers who documented rural England before electricity reached its outer edges. But the longer you look, the less ordinary it becomes. The scene depicts 4 children standing in a fog-choked meadow, their bare feet half sunk in the earth. Behind them rises a twisted, skeletal tree, its roots coiling outward as though clawing for escape. The ground seems wrong, uneven, disturbed, as if something beneath had been recently unearthed. Each child wears a mask. Not the festive kind, nor the delicate papier-mâché of carnival portraits. These are crude, sewn from what appears to be organic material, leather or perhaps something less identifiable. Their surfaces are stitched together with rough, uneven seams that resemble scars rather than craftsmanship. And each mask bears a painted grin, too wide, curving unnaturally toward the temples. Even under the distortion of the century-old film, the smiles are wrong. They give the illusion of happiness without containing any trace of it. When the photograph was examined under magnification, historians noted anomalies, faint, almost translucent shapes in the mist behind the children. At first, they appeared to be artifacts of exposure. But further digital enhancement revealed something else. There are other faces in the fog. Dozens of them. Their features are faint, incomplete, eyeless hollows where sight should be, lips that seem drawn in lines too deep, too old. And yet, they all share one expression, a stretched imitation of a human smile. Experts disagreed on the date. Some believed the image was taken around 1903, based on the children's clothing, simple smocks, woolen trousers, handmade shoes. Others argued it could be earlier. What they all agreed on, however, was that the masks were unlike anything from known rural customs. They were not ceremonial, not theatrical. They were, as one curator from the British Folklore Society remarked, artifacts of silence, meant not to conceal identity, but to replace it. The more the photograph was studied, the stranger it became. Infrared analysis of the glass plate revealed faint markings along the border, words etched by hand into the emulsion before it had dried. The script was archaic, almost runic, and though most of it was illegible, a single phrase was tentatively translated by linguistic experts. 4 faces given. The ground remembers. Those who handled the plate for extended periods reported dizziness, mild nausea, and what one archivist described as the sensation of being watched through stillness. After 3 weeks of study, the plate was sealed again and transferred to private storage. Officially, it remains in the collection of the Somerset Historical Archive, though no public records of its catalog number exist. Unconfirmed accounts claim that 2 of the men involved in its discovery, the demolition foreman and one of the archivists, later took their own lives within months of viewing it. Both left notes containing nearly identical phrases. "It smiled at me." And yet, the photograph endures. Digitized, replicated, passed from one set of curious hands to another, it circulates quietly through the darker corners of the internet, always accompanied by the same warning. If you look long enough, the faces begin to move. Pause. A faint sound of children's laughter fades in, distant, echoing, hollow. Narrator, Theo. No one knows who the children were. No one knows who took the photograph. But every attempt to trace the origin leads back to the same patch of land, the valley where Graven Hollow once stood. A place where people once smiled not from joy, but because something beneath the soil demanded it. Static builds. The image distorts. Fade to black. Soft wind. The creak of old wood. A single church bell tolls once, then fades into silence. Narrator, Theo. Graven Hollow. A name almost lost to history. A place that existed briefly and then simply stopped. Nestled in a narrow valley between the Mendip Hills of northern Somerset, Graven Hollow was never large enough to appear on official maps. Even its existence was pieced together through scattered parish records, agricultural ledgers, and the fading memory of families who no longer claimed descent from it. By 1890, the census listed no more than 300 residents. They were sheep herders, spinners, and barley farmers, people of the soil who relied on the rhythm of seasons and superstition in equal measure. Theirs was a life balanced between toil and silence, where days were dictated by the land and nights by the sound of wind moving through the heather-covered hills. And yet, something about Graven Hollow was different. Visitors in the late 19th century wrote of a strange unease that settled over the valley, a stillness that seemed too deliberate, too heavy. Local tales spoke of the hollow as a gifted place, blessed, they said, by ancient spirits who kept the crops rich and disease away. The villagers left small offerings at the borders of their fields, bowls of milk, honey, and the carved likeness of smiling faces. Always smiling. The church that stood in the center of the village, St. Alwyn's Chapel, was built in 1768 over the remains of a much older stone circle. Its foundation stones still bore markings that resembled runes, which parish priests ordered scrubbed away but could never fully remove. By all outward appearances, Graven Hollow was a peaceful, industrious community. But those who stayed longer than a few nights told a different story. They spoke of how the villagers refused to go outdoors on nights when the moon was new, how they covered mirrors with cloth and barred their windows with bundles of dried thistle, and how, every 7th autumn, something changed. In the early days of October, laughter began to echo through the fields, the laughter of children, though none were ever seen. Fires would burn on the hillsides, and the air would carry the scent of honey and rot. The villagers called it the Hollow Feast. No one from outside was ever permitted to attend. The only surviving account comes from the journal of a traveling reverend, Father Alistair Breen, who visited Graven Hollow in 1889. He described arriving at dusk to find the streets empty, every door locked, and strange symbols painted above the thresholds, simple circles with a line drawn through each, like a mouth sewn shut. That night, Breen claimed he saw figures moving through the fog, small, barefoot, carrying what looked like masks made from bark or hide. He heard them singing in a low, droning tone, a rhythm without melody. His final journal entry reads, "They smile even when no joy exists. Their faces change as the fire burns. I know now why the hills are hollow." He was never seen again. His horse was found days later, tied to a fence on the road out of the valley. The saddle was coated in a fine, sticky residue that smelled faintly of wax and iron. By 1900, the outside world had largely forgotten Graven Hollow. Roads bypassed it. Trade stopped. The railway line that once passed within 20 miles was rerouted after an unexplained landslide buried part of the track. In isolation, the villagers became self-contained, their surnames repeating generation after generation, their customs ossifying into ritual. According to the few remaining church records, Graven Hollow held no funerals between 1895 and 1903. No burials. No baptisms. No marriages. 8 years of silence. Then suddenly the ledger ends. The last entry, written in trembling hand by the vicar himself, reads simply, "The feast is complete. The smiles will hold." No one knows what happened next. When investigators returned decades later, the valley was empty, houses reduced to foundations, the church tower collapsed, and the well in the square filled with stagnant water. But even after a century, visitors still describe hearing laughter echoing between the hills. Always children's laughter. Always when the moon is gone. The wind rises. A distant child giggle, distorted, echoed. Narrator, Theo. Graven Hollow was not forgotten by accident. It was erased, deliberately, methodically, as if to contain something that memory itself could not safely hold. Whatever the villagers worshipped, whatever they fed beneath those barren hills, they believed it listened. And it smiled back. Silence. The faint buzz of static creeps in, like breath against a microphone. Fade to black. A soft hiss. The creak of an old chair. A woman's faint humming drifts through static, tuneless, low and sorrowful. Narrator, Theo. Among the fragments recovered from the ruins of Graven Hollow, one account stands apart from the rest. It is the story of Marjorie Kellen, known in local folklore simply as the Widow of the Hollow. Her name appears only twice in official records. Once in the 1891 census, listed as Marjorie Kellen, widow, aged 33, and once more in a church ledger, beside a child's baptism. The entry, written in a different hand, bears no date, only a name, Elias Kellen. Nothing else about her life was documented. Everything that follows comes from oral accounts, retold by the few descendants of those who fled the valley before its final days. Marjorie lived in a small cottage at the northern edge of the hollow, where the land sloped into peat bog and the soil bled rust-colored water. Her husband, a shepherd, had died the winter before, found frozen near the marsh, his face twisted in an expression that none of the men could describe without lowering their voices. She was left alone with her son, Elias, who was said to be frail and sickly from birth, a quiet boy who never spoke above a whisper. He spent hours staring at the fields, watching the fog drift and fold over the grass like breath. After her husband's death, neighbors claimed that Marjorie began to change. She spoke less, slept little, and was often seen walking the lanes at night, barefoot and murmuring. On her doorstep, she left small bundles of straw bound with twine, each shaped like a child's face, crude, smiling, and eyeless. When asked about them, she would only say, "So they know who we are." At first, the villagers pitied her. But pity turned to unease when Elias began to speak in his sleep, muttering in a language none recognized, punctuated by laughter that didn't sound like his own. One neighbor, a farmer's wife named Edith Ray, later told her granddaughter that she once looked through Marjorie's window at dusk and saw the boy sitting by the hearth, his hands held up before the fire as if warming them, though the flames were cold and blue. Behind him, on the wall, hung 4 masks. Each different, each carved from dark wood and painted with a grin. When the feast season approached that autumn, Marjorie stopped leaving her home altogether. Smoke rose from her chimney every night, though no one ever saw her at the market. Children dared each other to creep close enough to her door to listen. One boy swore he heard someone singing inside, not one voice, but several, blending together, soft and slow like a lullaby underwater. Then one morning, the smoke ceased. The vicar and 2 men went to check on her. They found the door ajar, the interior dark and silent. The hearth had gone cold, and the air smelled faintly of honey and decay. In the center of the room sat Elias's small chair, turned toward the wall. On the table beside it lay a mask, larger than the others, carved from something pale and slightly translucent. Its grin was perfect. Marjorie was gone. So was the boy. Only one thing was left behind, a message scrawled across the inside of the cottage door, written in soot and ash. The feast must have children. After that winter, the sightings began, stories whispered among shepherds and wanderers passing through the valley before it was abandoned. They spoke of a woman seen walking the fields in the fog, holding a child by the hand. She never turned when called to, never spoke. Her face was hidden by her hair, and the child's by a mask. Those who saw them claimed the air grew heavy, that their own faces began to ache as if forced into a smile they could not control. When the parish investigators came decades later, they found Marjorie's cottage reduced to stone and ivy. But in the soil where the hearth once stood, they unearthed remnants of something that should not have endured: a child's shoe, perfectly preserved in wax, and a small wooden carving, a smiling face with no eyes. A faint lullaby begins, the same humming from before, growing louder, closer. Narrator, Theo. Some say the widow's grief opened the first crack, that her sorrow was what the hollow had been waiting for. Others believe she was chosen long before that night, her child offered not from despair, but devotion. Whatever the truth, the villagers began to change after she disappeared. Smiles lingered longer. Eyes looked duller. And when the feast came again, no one wept for the widow or her son. They only smiled. The lullaby fades into the sound of distant laughter, soft, childlike, echoing across a wide empty field. Fade to black. A low wind hums through dead branches. The faint rustle of leaves. A heartbeat begins, slow and deliberate. Narrator, Theo. The Hollow Feast. The very name still sends shivers down the spines of those who stumble upon it in old texts. For outsiders, it was whispered about in vague terms, a celebration of the land, a harvest rite, children's play. For the villagers of Graven Hollow, it was neither play nor celebration. It was a debt owed to something that lived beneath the hills, something patient, something that remembered. Accounts of the feast are sparse. There are no photographs, no official records, no letters. Only fragments, whispers from shepherds, diary entries of traveling priests, and the occasional confession left behind in the dust of abandoned homes. According to these fragments, the feast began weeks before the new moon of October. The children of Graven Hollow, and sometimes those who had recently arrived, like Elias Kellen, were carefully selected by the village elders. These elders were never called by name in surviving records. They were simply keepers, guardians of the valley's unspoken laws. The children were fed a peculiar mixture of substances each night. One recipe, recorded in a tattered 19th-century diary, combined blackened honey with herbs whose names had been lost. This meal was meant to prepare them, to make their skin supple, receptive, and, according to one note, hungry for what was to come. The final days of the feast were the most terrifying. Children were dressed not in costumes but in skins. The masks, sewn, stretched, and painted, were placed over their faces while they slept. Those who survived to tell the story, or in some cases were seen decades later, claimed that the masks were alive. That they grew over the children, molding themselves to every contour, every nerve, every twitch of flesh. The rituals of the feast were conducted on the central hill of the hollow, beneath the skeletal branches of the old oak known as the Sentinel. The village circle would form around the children, chanting in a dialect lost to all modern scholars. It combined fragments of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and a language that had no name, a cadence that seemed to vibrate with the soil itself. Observers, when present, reported strange phenomena. Candles would flare and dim in impossible rhythms. Shadows moved independently of the firelight. Some claimed the earth beneath the sentinel's roots pulsed, as if breathing. Then came the laughter. It began as a whisper, soft and careful, but grew into a chorus. It was the children's voices, or so it sounded. But it was wrong. Hollow. Echoing. Multiplying. One witness, a wandering tinker in 1901, described it in his journal. I heard the children laugh and my ears bled. I saw 4 faces grinning from the mist. Yet they were not 4. There were hundreds, all with mouths stretched, all staring. This is the point where the feast ceases to be understandable in human terms. Those present claimed that the masks were not merely coverings. They were conduits, vessels through which something ancient, older than the valley itself, fed. The children became both hosts and sacrifices, their faces the currency of a ritual that maintained a fragile balance. The hollow would stay dormant, the crops would flourish, and the village would remain unharmed, so long as the smiles endured. By the final night, the children were taken to the very center of the circle. They did not resist. No child screamed, though some were seen trembling. The elders would chant, and the masks seemed to pulse with their voices. And then the moment came, the masks fused. It was described in one priest's confession, Father Alistair Breen, writing in 1888, as, "The faces are no longer theirs. They move, breathe, and smile as one. I have seen it and my eyes will never forgive me. The children are vessels now, and the hollow is satisfied." When the feast ended, the children were returned to their homes. Some were never seen again. Others wandered the valley in silence, their faces hidden, refusing food or speech. The masks, in many cases, could not be removed, even by the most skilled hands. The grin would remain, etched into skin and soul alike. Those who survived into adulthood rarely spoke. One account, from the last known resident of Gravenhollow, recorded in 1910, reads, "I remember the feast. I remember the songs and the laughter that came from beneath. I remember the masks. I do not know how I survived it. Every October I feel them watching, waiting." A single, faint heartbeat quickens. The rustling of leaves grows into the soft sound of children running through mist. Narrator, Theo. The Hollow Feast was not a festival in the way we understand them today. It was a contract, a transaction. And in Gravenhollow, every 7th year, the debt came due. To this day, the valley sleeps quietly under heather and stone. But those who venture near on the new moon of October sometimes hear faint laughter carried on the wind, small footsteps in the mud, moving in unison, and glimpses of pale masks, half hidden among the roots of the sentinel. The laughter crescendos, then fades into silence. A single whisper lingers, "The hollow is hungry." Fade to black. The faint click of a shutter. A soft hiss of a darkroom lamp. The smell of chemicals almost tangible. Narrator, Theo. On October 10, 1903, the Hollow Feast was observed, at least partially, by an outsider. His name was William Carow, a traveling photographer known for documenting rural England. Carow had journeyed through Somerset on commission from a London newspaper, tasked with capturing images of harvest celebrations in remote villages. Gravenhollow, with its unremarkable cottages and fields, appeared on no map he had studied. He arrived at dusk, led only by rumor and the soft glow of candlelight in the valley below. From a distance, Carow observed children moving in the fields, their silhouettes blurred by mist. They carried small bundles, hunched and careful, like creatures performing a ceremony older than memory. Carow wrote in his diary, discovered decades later, that the children moved in unison, as if guided by some invisible metronome. They never looked at him, yet he felt their attention. The valley itself seemed to watch, listening. He approached the village cautiously, setting up his large plate camera near the hill where the sentinel oak stood. The camera was cumbersome, requiring minutes for each exposure. But the moment he raised the lens, he realized the children were waiting. Not moving in play, but poised as if the very air around them compelled them to stand. He took the photograph. For children, their faces obscured by masks, standing barefoot in the foggy field. Behind them, the twisted roots of the sentinel oak clawed at the earth, curling toward the camera like fingers. When Carow developed the plate in his improvised darkroom that evening, he was confronted with something he could not explain. At first, the negative showed not 4 children, but dozens, perhaps hundreds. Figures blurred together, all wearing similar masks, their postures synchronized. He saw them in the shadows, in the fog, in the reflections of the glass itself. As the chemical process continued, the extra figures faded. Only 4 remained, but the memory of the others, or something that the plate retained, lingered in his vision. Carow noted in his diary, "I saw what should not exist. Faces that moved beneath the soil, their eyes upon me, grinning without mouths. When I touched the plate it was warm, breathing." Carow never spoke publicly of what he saw. His diary, recovered in 1993 from an antiques shop in Bristol, contains repeated entries of nightmares. He wrote of hearing children singing in languages unknown to him, a mix of Celtic tones, Anglo-Saxon remnants, and syllables that seemed not of this world. In one entry he attempted to transcribe the melody. It is not music, but a rhythm, pulsing from beneath. It speaks of hunger, of offerings, and of the smiles that feed. He returned to Gravenhollow the following morning, hoping to photograph the children again. The village was empty. No smoke rose from chimneys, no figures moved in the fields, and even the sentinel oak appeared twisted further, as if it had grown overnight. Carow later writings grow erratic. He mentions seeing shadows moving across the plate, hearing whispering from empty streets, and a persistent sensation that something followed him when he walked through the valley. One line, scrawled at the bottom of a page, reads, "They are patient. They wait for the next feast. I am marked." After 1903, Carow never photographed children again. He burned most of his plates, keeping only the single image of the 4 masked children. He refused to show it to anyone. Yet the photograph survived, eventually passing into private hands, where it became the subject of study for historians, folklorists, and psychologists alike. Even in the digital age, it retains a reputation for inducing unease. Observers report an uncanny sensation of being watched, the faint movement of shadows at the edges of the frame, and a compulsion to glance over their shoulders after viewing it. Caro Diary also contains sketches of the masks themselves. They were simple in appearance but horrifying in detail: asymmetrical stitching, exaggerated smiles, hollow eyes. The edges of the masks were organic, almost living, and he speculated, though he dared not write it explicitly, that the children were not wearing them. The masks were growing, fusing, and breathing as if with a will of their own. By the time Caro died, decades later, he was a recluse. His notebooks were filled with diagrams of circles, patterns, and strange inscriptions, which modern scholars now interpret as attempts to map the hollow's influence, a lattice of unseen forces tied to the valley, the masks, and the feast itself. The soft click of the shutter repeats. A faint hum rises, like hundreds of children singing beneath the earth. Fade to black. Narrator, Theo. The photograph endures. For children, standing silently, their smiles fixed, waiting for the next cycle of the hollow feast. And perhaps, for the next observer who dares to look too closely. A distant wind whistles through skeletal branches. Footsteps crunch softly in the undergrowth. A faint, hollow giggle echoes. Narrator, Theo. The feast was meant to end at sunrise, but for the children of Graven Hollow, nothing ever returned to normal. Within days, reports began to surface, whispers first, barely audible, of children missing from cottages, wandering the fog-laden fields, or found in strange positions, their masks fused to their faces. The earliest recorded case was Elias Kellen, the widow's son. According to surviving testimony, he vanished from his bed on the night of the feast. The next morning, he was found standing beneath the sentinel oak, barefoot in frost-stiffened grass. His eyes were open, yet unseeing. The mask he had worn during the feast was still in place, pressed tightly to his skin, and every stitch had fused with flesh. The village doctor, Jonathan Price, examined him. His notes, preserved in part, describe a scene that defied understanding. The mask has become one with the child. The seams appear as tissue. Fingers beneath the surface move, almost independently. Elias does not speak, does not eat, only stares and smiles. Soon, others followed. Within the week, 3 more children, those observed by Caro and the remaining village children, were found in similar states. They were discovered at the edges of the fields, in barns, and once, in the ruins of a collapsed cottage. Each wore a mask identical in construction to Elias's, and each refused to remove it. Attempts to cut the mask away caused the children extreme distress, convulsions, and in some cases, fainting. Neighbors recalled seeing them walking in silent procession through the mist, their heads tilted at impossible angles, their feet moving in unnaturally precise rhythm. Some described the air around them as thick, like breathing through damp cloth. And always the smile, impossibly wide, grotesque, wrong. By the 3rd day, the children had begun to exhibit behaviors that terrified the villagers. They hummed in the lost dialect of the feast, a language nobody understood but seemed to resonate from the soil beneath them. They gestured toward the hills, tracing invisible paths, sometimes kneeling in the mud as if listening. Their eyes, visible through the hollowed masks, were glassy and unblinking. Father Alistair Breen's earlier confessions, long dismissed as superstition, suddenly made sense. He wrote of a feeding of innocence beneath the sentinel oak, a ritual that ensured the hollow remained dormant and the valley's soil fertile. The villagers, paralyzed by fear, did nothing. Any attempt to intervene seemed to intensify the children's suffering. One account describes a farmer trying to pull a mask from his granddaughter's face. She shrieked, her body contorting in unnatural ways. When he released her, she stood silently, her grin fixed, as though nothing had happened. Then, on the night of October 12th, the disappearances escalated. Witnesses reported seeing shadows moving in groups of 3, small shapes slipping over the hilltops. They seemed to carry a rhythm, an invisible chant accompanying their steps. By morning the children, all of them, had vanished. No footprints remained in the frost, no trails in the soil. Only the masks, some half-buried, others stacked neatly in fields or atop fence posts, remained behind. Dr. Price's notes after the event become chaotic, almost unreadable. He describes the masks as living tissue, the seams pulsing, and hundreds of tiny fingers moving beneath the surface, exploring, touching, counting. He writes, "They were not taken. They were claimed. By what I cannot say. Only that the valley waits and the masks remain." The hollow itself seemed to reclaim the children. In the days after the feast, the air in the valley turned heavy. Animals avoided the fields. Crops that should have thrived wilted overnight. Villagers reported seeing shapes in the mist, pale, grinning figures standing just beyond the edge of vision, watching silently, waiting. Graven Hollow was never the same. Families began leaving, one by one, abandoning homes and livestock. By the following year, the village population had dropped to fewer than 50. The traditions that had governed life there for centuries dissolved in fear. And the masks persisted. They were collected by some, discarded by others, and occasionally glimpsed decades later in attics, barn rafters, and private collections. Each time, those who encountered them reported the same sensations: unease, nausea, and the inexplicable feeling that the masks remembered. A faint whisper rises on the wind, a child's voice, low, many-toned, repeating over and over. Narrator, Theo. The vanishing was not merely disappearance. It was transformation. Those who were lost did not simply leave the valley, they became part of it, bound to the soil, to the fog, to the whispering oak. And in every cycle of the feast, every 7th year, the hollow waited patiently for the next offering. The whispering fades into silence. Only the sound of the wind, moving through empty branches, remains. Fade to black. A faint scratching. A low hum, like hundreds of tiny fingers moving over wood. A metallic clink echoes softly. Narrator, Theo. The masks of Graven Hollow were never costumes. They were artifacts of devotion, instruments of transformation, and vessels for something older than memory itself. Historians and folklorists have long debated their composition. When examined under modern magnification and spectroscopy, the masks revealed details that defy explanation. They bore the appearance of organic material, yet not animal skin, not plant matter, not any substance catalogued by science. Some pores resembled mammalian skin, yet were arranged in patterns that biology cannot produce. Fibers were interwoven with unknown resins, minerals, and traces of what appeared to be charred human hair, though tests could not confirm origin. Professor Michael Rise, a specialist in British folklore at Cambridge, hypothesized that these masks were part of a long-forgotten ritual tradition. According to his research, isolated communities like Graven Hollow developed unique methods for preserving organic matter, combining plant, mineral, and animal elements into composites now considered heretical or obscene. The stitches were irregular, asymmetrical, appearing almost as if the material itself guided the needle, forming seams that were both scar and suture. Independent researchers propose an even darker theory. Patterns of child disappearances in Somerset, spanning decades, suggest the masks were conduits, absorbing the essence of innocence. Every 7 years, when the Hollow Feast was performed, the children wearing these masks became living vessels, their faces, their joy, their very breath feeding whatever entity slept beneath the valley. Some of the surviving masks show subtle movement, even decades after creation. In the 2018 excavation of the Hollow, archaeologists found dozens of masks carefully stacked in a circular stone chamber beneath the village square. When photographed and digitally analyzed, the mask's surfaces appeared to undulate, almost imperceptibly, as if breathing. Tiny grooves, once thought to be decorative stitching, were revealed to shift minutely, patterns rearranging themselves over time. The mask's design was consistent, yet variable, eyes wide and hollow, mouths exaggerated in grotesque smiles. Each stitch seemed intentional, each line of pigment applied to evoke pleasure and horror simultaneously. Specialists believe that the asymmetry was deliberate, a distortion necessary to bridge the human face and whatever entity they were feeding. Accounts from survivors and witnesses indicate that the masks were not merely worn, they were grown. Alice Radcliffe, the younger sister of one of the feast's victims, claimed in her final confession in 2021 that the ritual began weeks in advance. Children were fed a substance she described as black honey, harvested from hives kept in the ruins of the old abbey. This honey rendered their skin pliable, receptive, and malleable. When the feast began, the masks were applied while the children slept, alive and patient. Over 3 days, the masks fused with the flesh, transforming the wearer into something neither fully human nor fully object. Those who attempted to remove the masks reported immediate pain and psychological trauma. Some masks seemed impossible to remove without tearing the wearer's flesh. Doctors who examined the children noted that sutures had merged into living tissue, and beneath the surface, tiny movements suggested independent life. Fingers beneath the skin, Dr. Jonathan Price wrote, exploring, counting, waiting. Modern digitization and forensic analysis of surviving photographs reinforce these accounts. Enlarged images show subtle movements along the mask edges, slight distortions of facial structure that could not exist naturally. Shadows around the masks sometimes hint at forms that do not align with the child's own anatomy, extra limbs, faint reflections of bodies beneath the skin, or perhaps other children, trapped, folded, or layered within the material itself. The mask's purpose seems singular: to transform, to contain, and to offer. They were portals, gateways between the human and something ancient. In Graven Hollow, smiles were never innocent. They were instruments, tools, and obligations. A faint whisper rises, a chorus of children, their laughter discordant and layered, echoing from unseen corners. The scratching of stitches grows louder, as if someone is sewing in the darkness. Narrator, Theo. The hollow feast could end. The valley could fall silent. But the masks remain. Even now, decades later, in private collections, attics, and sealed chambers, they wait. Patient. Watching. Counting the years in cycles of 7. Because in Graven Hollow, a smile was never just a smile. It was a contract. A promise. A portal. The whisper crescendos, then abruptly stops. Silence. Fade to black. A soft wind rustles through overgrown ruins. Distant laughter drifts, almost imperceptible. Camera shutter clicks. Silence follows. Narrator, Theo. Graven Hollow no longer appears on maps. Its cottages have crumbled, the fields have been swallowed by moss and heather, and the sentinel oak stands as a gnarled sentinel over empty soil. Yet the legacy of the hollow feast endures. The masks, once confined to ritual, survived in attics, antique shops, and private collections. Each retains a subtle but undeniable presence, a sensation of being observed, of unseen eyes tracking your movements. Scholars who have studied photographs of the children report unexplained phenomena, shadows shifting in ways impossible for light to account for, edges of masks subtly moving, the faint impression of movement beneath the surface. In 2018, archaeologists permitted to excavate the hollow uncovered a circular stone chamber beneath what had been the village square. Carefully stacked inside were dozens of masks, some brittle with age, others still supple. Beneath the masks, a substance described as organic, unidentified, and impossible to categorize, oozed faintly in the dim light. 2 members of the excavation team later sought psychiatric treatment, reporting recurring nightmares in which masked children stared at them from corners of rooms, tilting their heads at impossible angles. The site was sealed immediately, the artifacts removed and classified as culturally sensitive. But even when the masks were hidden, the influence of the hollow persisted. In the decades following the feast of 1903, nearby towns reported small footprints appearing overnight in mud and snow, always in groups of 3, leading to empty fields or abandoned buildings. Residents occasionally heard children laughing where no children existed, their voices layered, discordant, and impossible to locate. Some reported glimpsing figures in the fog, pale, grinning, masks stretched unnaturally wide, watching from hilltops at dusk. The Radcliffe family provides one of the most disturbing connections to modern times. In 2021, Sarah Whitmore, the granddaughter of Alice Radcliffe, came forward with a story her grandmother had kept secret all her life. Alice, Eugenia's younger sister, had survived the feast. At 93, she revealed that the masks were not simply worn by the children. They grew on them, alive and patient. Weeks before the feast, the children were fed a black honey harvested from ruins in the valley. The substance made their skin malleable and receptive, preparing them to be vessels for something beneath the hollow. On the night of the feast, the masks fused to the children over 3 days. Alice described them as laughing vessels, conduits for an ancient entity that required joy to remain dormant. Without these offerings, the hollow's hunger could awaken. Alice insisted the transformation was irreversible. The children were changed forever, their smiles no longer human. She died 3 days after sharing her story, clutching the original photograph from 1903, which she annotated. Eugenia never stopped smiling. Even when they removed the mask, the grin remained. Too wide. Too wrong. It was no longer her smile. The photograph has since circulated online, digitized and analyzed repeatedly. Some observers claim the image changes subtly over time. Additional masked figures appear in the background, or expressions shift slightly. Others report unease, paranoia, and dreams in which the children silently enter rooms, tilting their heads, grinning at impossible angles. Even more disturbing is the discovery of hidden inscriptions in the shadows of the photograph. Using digital magnification, linguists specializing in dead scripts have identified fragments that appear to be dates, not of the original image, but of the future. One translation references October 2031, precisely 7 cycles of 7 years from the next total lunar eclipse visible from Somerset. The hollow waits. Its demand for joy and innocence continues, measured in cycles, patient and unyielding. Even now, the ruins remain dangerous. Hikers report strange lights in the hills during October, and local authorities caution against venturing near the old village. Footprints appear overnight, children's voices drift through fog, and masks occasionally surface in private collections, carrying the same eerie sensation of consciousness. The faint sound of children singing begins, layered and impossible to locate, overlapping with a soft heartbeat. Narrator, Theo. The legacy of Graven Hollow is not merely a story of vanished children or grotesque masks. It is a warning, a reminder that in some places, innocence is currency, and joy is a debt owed to something ancient, patient, and unyielding. The children of the Hollow still wait. The masks remain, and the valley still listens. And perhaps, when the next cycle arrives, the feast will begin again. A single laugh echoes, high, hollow, too wide, followed by silence. Fade to black.